The council chamber fell so quiet that Lavinia Hawkins could hear the blood rushing in her own ears. Vernon Wallace stood at the center of the room, his marshal's badge catching the lamplight, his jaw set like iron, his dark eyes burning with something that was not anger alone, but something far more dangerous, righteous fury mixed with a tenderness he had never once tried to hide from her. Around him, 7 men sat behind a long oak table, men who held every scrap of power in Redemption, Texas, men who had built this town on promises they never intended to keep. The year was 1882, and outside these walls the autumn wind was tearing through the mesquite. But inside this room the air had gone still and hot and suffocating, the way air does right before a storm breaks everything apart. "This woman kept her word," Vernon said, and his voice did not shake, not even slightly, "and you broke yours." 7 pairs of eyes shifted to Lavinia, who stood against the far wall with her wrists unbound but her freedom very much in question. She watched Vernon's shoulders square beneath his worn leather coat, watched him plant his boots wider on the floorboards as if bracing for whatever these men would hurl at him next, and something cracked open in the center of her chest that she was not prepared for. She had been called a swindler, a fraud, a threat to public order, a woman of dangerous character. She had survived 6 weeks in a town that wanted to use her and then discard her. She had kept every single promise she had made to this council. And now, the one man who had witnessed all of it was putting his badge, his livelihood, and quite possibly his life on a table already stacked against both of them. Council Chairman Elias Croft leaned forward, his gray mustache twitching. "Marshal Wallace, you would do well to remember where your loyalties lie." "I know exactly where they lie," Vernon said. "That is the whole problem." Lavinia closed her eyes for one breath. She thought about how different everything had looked 6 weeks ago, when she had stepped off the southbound stage from San Antonio with $40, a carpetbag, and a secret that could get her killed. She had not planned to trust anyone in Redemption. She certainly had not planned to trust the Marshal. She had not planned to fall in love. Redemption sat on the edge of the Brazos River country, in a bend of flat grassland that turned gold in October. And it looked, when the stage first rattled into town, like every other ambitious settlement she had passed through on her way west from Georgia. There was a wide main street with a hardware store and a land office and a hotel with a sagging front porch, a church whose whitewash was already beginning to peel, a saloon that was doing far better business than the church, and at the end of the street, the marshal's office, which was the only building that appeared to have been recently repaired. She had noted that last detail with professional interest because she was a woman who paid attention to details, a habit she had developed out of pure necessity after her father died and left her with nothing but a name, some worn-out land in Forsyth County, and a stack of his legal papers that had opened her eyes to things that well-dressed men in powerful rooms did not expect women's eyes to open to. Her name before she was Lavinia Hawkins had been Lavinia Morrow, daughter of Edmund Morrow, surveyor and land agent, a man who had worked honestly his whole career and been destroyed by men who did not. She had taken her mother's maiden name after she left Georgia because the men who had destroyed her father were still looking for his papers, and she was still carrying them, pressed flat inside the lining of her carpetbag, a hidden record of fraudulent land grants, forged deeds, and stolen mineral rights stretching from Atlanta all the way west into Texas. She had come to Redemption specifically because the trail of fraud led here, to a council of 7 men who had built their fortunes on ground they did not legally own, ground that had been surveyed by her father before they had him ruined and then quietly removed. What she had not expected was the welcoming committee. The stage had barely stopped rolling when a tall man in a brown coat stepped up to the door and offered his hand. He had dark hair that needed cutting, a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and eyes the color of strong coffee that looked at her with a directness she was not accustomed to receiving from strangers. His badge read Marshal in plain letters. His handshake was firm without being aggressive. "Vernon Wallace," he said, "welcome to redemption. Are you the woman who wrote to the council about the surveying contract?" She had been. She had spent 3 months constructing that identity carefully, presenting herself as a professional land surveyor trained by her father, which was true, and available to complete the boundary survey the council needed for their planned railroad expansion, which was also true, though her reasons for wanting to conduct that survey were not quite what the council believed them to be. "Lavinia Hawkins," she said, and met his eyes without flinching. "I am." Something shifted in his expression. Not suspicion exactly, more like recalibration, the way a man looks when reality does not quite match what he pictured. She was 30 years old, with dark red hair she kept pinned back severely, green eyes she had been told were unsettling, and hands that were calloused from years of actual survey work. She was not what men expected when they read the name L. Hawkins on a professional letter. "The council is expecting you tomorrow morning," Vernon said. "I can walk you to the hotel if you like." "I can find my own way," she said, and then softened it slightly because she needed allies, not enemies, and because something about his directness made her want to match it. "But I would not object to company." He had walked beside her down the main street of Redemption with his hands in his coat pockets, and he had told her things about the town that a man with something to hide would not tell a stranger. He had told her that the council ran most of the commercial decisions. He had told her that the land office had changed hands twice in 3 years under circumstances that made him uncomfortable. He had told her that he had been marshal for 4 years, and that he valued the law not as a tool of powerful men, but as a protection for everyone. And he had said that last part the way a man says something he has had to fight for. She had listened to all of it and filed it away, and told herself firmly that he was useful information only. She had believed that for approximately 4 days. The meeting with the council the next morning had gone exactly as she expected meetings with men like that always went. Elias Croft sat at the head of the table with the comfortable authority of a man who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. Beside him sat Aldous Prout, who owned the bank and who had the eyes of a man always calculating something. There were 5 others ranging in age and disposition, but sharing the same essential quality, which was the belief that their decisions were always correct because they were the ones making them. They had hired her to complete a professional land survey of the territory they intended to include in their railroad proposal, and they had offered her a specific payment upon completion, $150, and a letter of professional reference, and they had made her sign a contract with very precise language about what the survey would include and what it would exclude. She had signed that contract and she had read every word of it. What the contract did not say, what it could not say because saying it would have exposed everything, was that the council expected her to produce results that confirmed their existing claims. They wanted a survey that would make their fraudulent grants look legitimate. They had hired her because she was from out of state, and because they assumed a woman working alone would produce what they told her to produce or could be discredited if she did not. They had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Lavinia had begun the survey work the day after signing the contract. She worked with a theodolite and a surveyor's chain, and a notebook that she kept in her coat at all times, and she was thorough in a way that left no room for interpretation. She rose before dawn and worked until she could not see, and she covered ground that had not been properly measured in years, and every number she recorded was true because her father had taught her that a survey's only value was in its accuracy, and she had never once in her professional life produced a dishonest measurement. Vernon had appeared on her 3rd morning in the field, riding out from town on a bay horse with a saddlebag that turned out to contain coffee and cornbread wrapped in cloth. "You were out here yesterday at first light," he said, swinging down from the horse with the ease of someone who had grown up on horseback. "I thought you might be missing breakfast." She had stared at him for a moment, genuinely surprised. "You rode 6 miles to bring me breakfast." 5.5, he said. Are you going to argue about the distance or drink the coffee? She had drunk the coffee. He had helped her carry equipment to the next survey point, not because she asked, but because he was there and her arms were full, and he had been quiet in the way that useful people are quiet, not filling silence with noise but leaving it open for thinking. When she asked him to hold the far end of the chain at a specific marker stone, he had done it precisely, without questions. When she read the measurement and wrote it down, he had looked at her notebook with honest curiosity and asked her to explain what she was recording and why, and she had explained it, and he had listened with the same focused attention he seemed to give everything. By the end of that day, she knew 3 things. First, that Vernon Wallace was genuinely intelligent and genuinely curious, which was rarer than people acknowledged. Second, that he was honest in a bone-deep way that she recognized because her father had been the same. Third, that she was already in trouble where he was concerned because she could not look at him without noticing things she had no business noticing. The way he moved, the way his voice dropped when he was thinking carefully, the way he treated her like a person with full capability and judgment rather than a curiosity or a problem to be managed. She told herself she was projecting. She had been alone for a long time and she was in a stressful situation, and her judgment was compromised by proximity and gratitude. She told herself all of this very firmly for several more days, while he continued to ride out to her survey locations with coffee and questions, and that steady, unnerving attention. It was on the 8th day that she found the first serious discrepancy. She was running a boundary line in the southeast quadrant, following a creek bed that the existing land documents identified as the eastern border of the council's primary claim. According to her measurements, the creek was running a full quarter-mile east of where the documents placed it, which meant the land claimed under those documents extended well past the actual boundary and into territory that had been separately granted to a family named Oudekirk under a federal land act. The Oudekirk grant was legitimate. She had seen the originals among her father's papers. The council's claim in that area was not legitimate because it had been redrawn, subtly but unmistakably, to swallow the Oudekirk acreage after the family had been driven off that land 7 years ago under circumstances her father's notes described as manufactured debt and intimidation. She sat beside the creek for a long time looking at her measurements and her notes and the documents she had brought with her from Georgia, and she felt the weight of what she was holding settle into her like stone. This was the proof. Not just the fraud here in redemption, but the pattern of it. Her father's documented evidence of the original grants combined with her fresh survey measurements that showed exactly how those grants had been manipulated. Together, they were enough to bring to a federal land court. Together, they were enough to end the council's control of this territory and potentially restore what had been stolen not only from the Oudekirk family but from several others. Together, they were also enough to make her extremely dangerous to 7 powerful men who had been operating without consequences for years. She packed up her equipment that evening and rode back to town, and she nearly made it to the hotel before Vernon fell into step beside her on the street. "You found something," he said. It was not a question. She stopped walking and looked at him in the last orange light of the afternoon. "What makes you say that? You have been working through problems the whole ride back. You have that look." "What look?" "Like you are carrying something heavy and trying to decide whether to put it down or keep walking." He met her eyes directly. "You do not have to tell me what it is, but if it is the kind of thing that could put you in danger, I would like to know." The honest answer was yes, it was that kind of thing. The strategic answer was to say nothing, to trust no one, to get the evidence to the proper federal authority without involving anyone in redemption who might have competing loyalties. She knew what the strategic answer was. "Can I buy you supper?" she said instead. He looked at her for a moment and she saw something in his expression shift from professional concern into something quieter and more personal. "Yes," he said, "you can." They ate at the boarding house table because the hotel dining room was too public, and she watched him cut his food with the same focused care he gave everything else, and she told herself one more time that she was being foolish. Then she looked up and found him watching her with that steady gaze, and the thought dissolved before she could hold on to it. She did not tell him everything that night. She told him enough. She told him she had found a boundary discrepancy that suggested the council's land claims were not accurate, and she told him she had documents that might be relevant to a federal investigation, and she told him she needed to complete the full survey before she could take any action because she had signed a contract, and she intended to honor it completely. Every measurement, every notation, every deliverable she had committed to, because that was the only way her findings would be unimpeachable. He had listened to all of this without interrupting and then said, "How much danger are you in?" "I do not know yet," she said. "Possibly quite a lot if they realize what I have found before I am ready to bring it forward. Then I am going to keep riding out to your survey locations," he said, "not to interfere, just to be there." Something warmed in her chest that she did not know how to name. "Vernon." "I know," he said. "You can take care of yourself, I believe you. I am going to be there anyway." She had looked at him across the boarding house table with the lamplight between them and thought, with absolute clarity, that she was already far past the point of no return where he was concerned, and that she was terrified and grateful in equal measure. The next 3 weeks were the strangest and most vivid of her life. Each morning she went out to work her survey lines with the precise professional attention she owed her contract, and each morning Vernon appeared, sometimes with food, sometimes without, always with that quiet, watchful presence that had begun to feel less like protection and more like something she could not survive without. They talked while they worked, long, rambling conversations about everything and nothing, about the law and about land, and about what the West actually was versus what people back east imagined it to be. She told him about Georgia and about her father, careful at first and then less careful, then not careful at all. He told her about growing up in Kansas, about a family that had scattered in the years after the war, about choosing law enforcement because it was the one profession that let him stand between the powerful and the powerless, which was where he always felt he needed to be. "That sounds like it has cost you things," she said one afternoon when they were resting horses at a spring. "Some things," he said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. "A woman I was engaged to 8 years ago. She wanted me to take a position with a private land company her father owned. Good money, easy work, no risk. I could not do it. Why not? Because the company was doing exactly what it sounds like the council here has been doing, using legal language to peel land away from people who did not have the resources to fight back." He picked up a stone and turned it in his fingers. "She said I was choosing principle over family. She was not wrong. I was. I would make the same choice again." Lavinia looked at his profile against the afternoon sky and thought about the kind of solitude that kind of choice produced. She knew it intimately. She had been making versions of that same choice since she was 23 years old. "I would too," she said quietly. He turned and looked at her, and the silence between them changed texture entirely, became something dense and searching, and she held his gaze and did not look away, and he did not look away either. And then one of the horses shifted and broke the moment, and they both looked at the ground. That evening he walked her back to the hotel, and at the door he stopped and said her name very quietly, just Lavinia, not Miss Hawkins, and she turned around and he was close, closer than he had stood before, and his expression was the same one she kept trying to read and failing, too careful and too open at the same time. "I want to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said. "I think what you are doing is the bravest thing I have seen since I came to this town," he said. "And I want you to know that whatever happens with the survey and the council and all of it, I am on your side. Not because it is my job, because it is where I want to be." She stood in the doorway of the hotel in Redemption, Texas in October of 1882, and felt the entire careful architecture of her self-sufficiency creak under the weight of those words. She had built that architecture brick by brick for 7 years, and she had been very proud of it, and she recognized now that it was never going to survive Vernon Wallace. "That is either the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time," she said, "or it is going to make everything much more complicated." "I expect it is both," he said. She laughed, actually laughed, which surprised her, and then she went inside before she did something that could not be undone. She lay in the narrow hotel bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about dark eyes and steady hands and a man who had given up an engagement rather than compromise what he believed, and she was awake until nearly 3 in the morning. The trouble started on a Thursday. She was working the northwest quadrant, the last major section of her survey, when she noticed she was being followed. The man was not particularly subtle about it. He stayed at a distance, but he matched her movements, and when she stopped, he stopped, and he was wearing a flat-crowned hat and a canvas coat, and she recognized him from town as a man called Sedger who worked at the land office under Aldous Prout. She finished her work for the day methodically, made careful note of everything she had measured, and rode back to town at a pace that did not suggest she had noticed anything, and went directly to Vernon's office. He was at his desk reading case papers when she came in, and he stood immediately because the look on her face told him something had changed. "Someone from Prout's office followed me today," she said. Vernon's expression darkened. He went to the window and looked out at the street for a moment. How close did he get? Never within 50 yards. He was watching, not interfering, but it means they suspect something or they have decided to be cautious. How much survey work is left? 3 to 4 days if the weather holds. Can you finish the work while I am visible nearby? That is not a solution, Vernon, that is just making the problem quieter. If they decide to move against me before I have completed everything, a visible marshal is only going to slow them down, he said, and his voice was very even. That is all I need to do, slow them down long enough for you to finish. She looked at him across his office, this spare clean room with its rack of rifles and its wanted notices on the board and its single desk lamp, and she thought about hidden motives and forced choices and the specific danger of trusting anyone in a town built on someone else's stolen land. "You could lose your position over this," she said, "if the council decides you are obstructing them." "I could," he agreed. "That does not trouble you. Not nearly as much as you getting hurt would trouble me." The directness of it landed like a stone in still water, and she felt the ripples go all the way to her edges. She stood very still. "Vernon," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "I know the timing is wrong and the situation is wrong and you have more important things to think about. I am not asking for anything. I am telling you a fact because you deserve to know it." He picked up his hat from the desk. "Now, tell me exactly where you will be working tomorrow and what time you plan to start, and I will be there before you arrive," she told him. And then, because she could not help it, and because it was true, and because the long, careful years of keeping everything inside had somehow eroded in the past 3 weeks, she said, "I am telling you a fact too. You have made this the least alone I have felt since my father died." He went very still. Then he set his hat down again, which he had only just picked up, and crossed the room, and he took her hand in both of his, and he held it the way you hold something you are afraid of damaging. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "We are going to get through this." She believed him, which was itself remarkable. The next 2 days were tense in the way that the period before a storm is tense, a kind of stretched electrical quality to the air. She worked her remaining survey sections with focused precision, aware that Sedger or someone like him was likely watching from a distance, aware that Vernon was somewhere in her vicinity, though she could not always see him. The measurements she was taking now confirmed and extended everything she had found earlier. The fraud was not limited to the Oudekirk territory. It extended through 3 additional parcels in the northwest quadrant. Parcels claimed under documents she now had strong reason to believe had been redrawn after original surveys. Surveys her father had conducted. Surveys whose original numbers were recorded in his papers in her carpetbag. On the second day, during the afternoon, she was calculating a final measurement when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to find not Vernon but two men she did not recognize, hard-faced men with the look of hired laborers rather than landowners, riding toward her with a purposefulness that made her stomach tighten. They stopped their horses 20 feet from her, and one of them said, "Mr. Prout would like a word with you." "Mr. Prout can write me a letter," she said, and went back to her notebook. "He means now," the man said. She looked up at him steadily. "I am in the middle of contracted work for the council, which means my time during working hours is committed. If Mr. Prout would like to meet me in town this evening at the hotel, I will be glad to speak with him." She held the man's gaze without blinking. "Unless you are planning to physically prevent me from working, which would be a violation of the contract your employer signed, and I would suggest that a man who has spent years constructing legal documents does not want to begin violating legal documents in front of witnesses." The man looked around for witnesses and found, to his visible displeasure, Vernon Wallace on his bay horse on a low rise about 100 yards away, watching. The two men exchanged a glance. Then they rode away. She let out a slow breath and wrote the number she had been calculating in her notebook, very carefully, before her hand could start shaking. That evening in the hotel dining room, which she chose specifically because it was public, Aldous Prout came to find her alone. He was a narrow man with excellent clothes and a smile that did not reach his eyes, and he sat down across from her without being invited and folded his hands on the table as if they were having a friendly business discussion. "Miss Hawkins," he said, "I understand the survey is proceeding well." "Very well," she said. "I expect to have the full report ready within the week as specified in the contract." "Excellent." He paused. "We look forward to results that will allow the railroad proposal to move forward without complications." She looked at him pleasantly. "I will provide accurate results. That is what the contract requires." The smile tightened. "Of course. Accuracy. That is what we all want." Another pause, longer this time, and she could see behind his eyes the calculation that men like him always made. How much does she know? How much is she willing to risk? Can she be managed, or does she need to be removed? "I hope you have found Redemption to be a hospitable place." "I have," she said. "The Marshal in particular has been very helpful." Something flickered in Prout's expression. "Marshal Wallace is a dedicated public servant," he said carefully, "though he sometimes mistakes his jurisdiction." "Does he?" she said. "He tends to involve himself in matters that are properly the domain of civilian authorities." Prout unfolded his hands and placed them flat on the table. "It would be unfortunate if his involvement in your survey project were to create the appearance of impropriety." She understood the threat exactly. They intended to use Vernon against her if they could, to suggest that their professional relationship compromised the survey's integrity, to give themselves a reason to challenge her findings that had nothing to do with the data itself. "Mr. Prout," she said in the same pleasant tone, "the Marshal has assisted me in a logistical capacity on 2 occasions. He has not touched my equipment, reviewed my measurements, or had any input into my methodology. The survey is entirely my professional work. Any challenge to its accuracy will have to be substantiated by an opposing survey, and you are welcome to commission one." She picked up her coffee cup. "Will there be anything else?" He left without answering. She sat in the dining room for another 20 minutes after he left, drinking coffee she did not taste. And then she went upstairs and took out her father's papers and her own survey notes, and spread them across the bed, and began to write up the formal report that the contract required, making it as precise and legally airtight as a professional document could be. Because she had promised to deliver a complete survey, and she was going to deliver one that could not be dismantled. She worked through most of the night. The next morning she found an envelope slipped under her hotel room door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with no signature that read, "We know what your father was carrying. Give us the papers and leave town and you will not be harmed." She folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket and went to Vernon's office. He read the note once and then set it on his desk and looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something that went beyond professional concern into something harder and more personal. "How long have they known about your father's documents?" he asked. "I do not know, possibly since before I arrived. Possibly this is why they agreed to hire me, to get access to whatever my father had. They never intended to pay you the full contracted amount." "Almost certainly not." She sat in the chair across from his desk. "But it does not matter. I have enough for a federal land court complaint. The survey alone is damning, and with my father's original records it is overwhelming. I need to get both sets of documents to the circuit judge in Waco before the council finds a reason to move against me legally here." "How long will that take?" "The circuit judge is due in Abilene in 12 days. If I can get a writer to him there with a formal complaint and the documents before that, he will have to act." She looked at Vernon directly. "I need to finish my report today. I am going to deliver it to the council tomorrow morning exactly as the contract specifies, because I am not giving them any grounds to call me in breach of anything, and I need a trusted writer who can leave for Abilene tonight with copies of my father's papers and my preliminary findings." "I know a man," Vernon said. "Jim Reeves. He rides for me sometimes. He is completely reliable. Can you trust him with something this significant?" "With my life," Vernon said. "I have before." She nodded. Then she said, "Vernon, this is going to get worse before the judge acts. Even after he receives the complaint, it will take time for any authority to arrive, and the council is going to know something is happening the moment I deliver that report." "I know," he said. "They will come after you. They will try to use your office against me, or they will try to remove you from office so there is no one between them and Lavinia," he said, and the way he said her name stopped her completely. He came around the desk and crouched down to her eye level, which was such an unexpected gesture, so genuinely leveling, that she felt her throat tighten. "I have been the Marshal of Redemption for 4 years. I have dealt with men like Croft and Prout before, just not this particular version of them. I'm not frightened of losing my badge. I'm a little frightened of losing you, but that is my problem to manage, not yours." He held her gaze. "Finish your report. I will get Jim Reeves ready to ride tonight. And tomorrow morning we are going to walk into that council meeting together, and you are going to give them exactly what you promised." "Together," she repeated. "Together," he said, and he was so close that she could see the exact moment his professional composure cracked open around the edges, and something much warmer and more vulnerable came through. And she reached out without thinking and put her hand against the side of his face, and he turned into it slightly the way a man does when he has been holding himself very still for a very long time. "After this is over," she said. "Yes," he said. "After this is over." She took her hand back, and he stood up, and they both returned to being people with urgent things to accomplish. But the room felt different after that, warmer and more important, like something had been acknowledged that could not be taken back. She spent 12 hours writing the most complete, airtight, professionally devastating survey report of her career. She included every measurement, every reference point, every discrepancy with the existing land documents, and she attached a formal declaration identifying herself as the daughter of Edmund Morrow, licensed federal surveyor, and stating that she had in her possession original survey records that directly contradicted the land claims currently held by the Redemption Town Council. She wrote it in the clear, precise language her father had taught her, and she signed it with her full legal name. That night Jim Reeves rode for Abilene with sealed copies of everything. The next morning Lavinia walked down the main street of Redemption in the best dress she owned, which was dark green wool and entirely professional, with her survey report under her arm and Vernon Wallace beside her. And she thought about her father, and about all the years since his death, and about the long road from Georgia to this particular street in this particular town. And she felt afraid in the way that you feel afraid when something you have worked toward for years is finally about to happen, and there is no more preparing to be done, only doing. The council was assembled when they arrived, all 7 of them, which told her they had been warned. Elias Croft looked at Vernon with ill-concealed displeasure and said, "Marshal, this is a private business meeting." "And yet here I am," Vernon said pleasantly, and sat in a chair along the wall. Lavinia placed the survey report on the table in front of Croft and said, "Gentlemen, I have completed the professional land survey as specified in the contract, dated the 12th of October, 1882, signed by myself and Council Chairman Elias Croft. You will find the full measurements and analysis, along with a declaration I have attached, which I am required by professional ethics to include." Croft opened the report. She watched his face as he read the first page, then the second. The color drained out of it in a way that was almost cinematic. Prout reached over and took the report from him and read it faster, scanning for the specifics, and his face went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise and calculation, and then a cold, settled fury that was actually more frightening than Croft's shock. "This is fraudulent," Prout said. "It is not," she said. "It is accurate. Every measurement is verifiable. You are welcome to commission an independent survey, as I said to you last evening. You have made false claims about land documents that are entirely legitimate. I have made documented claims about land documents that contradict the original federal survey records conducted by my father, Edmund Morrow, whose original notebooks and measurement logs I have also preserved, and which I have forwarded to a federal land court for review." She kept her voice level. "The contract you signed with me required a complete and accurate survey. I have provided one. The contract also required payment upon delivery of that report. I am ready to receive that payment now." Dead silence. She had expected this silence. She had been prepared for it. What she had not been prepared for was the quality of it, the way the 7 men looked at each other in that room, communicating something she could not quite read, and then the way Croft leaned back in his chair and said, with a very deliberate calm, "Miss Hawkins, I believe there has been a misunderstanding about the terms of your contract." "There has not," she said. "The contract is in plain language." "The contract," Croft said, "was contingent on the production of results that supported the council's existing land position. As your report has failed to do so, we consider the contract terms unfulfilled." The trap. She had known it was coming, but hearing it stated openly still sent a cold wave through her. "That interpretation is not in the contract," she said. "Show me the clause." "It is implied." "Nothing is implied in a legal document. Either the language is there or it is not." She looked at Croft steadily. "I will not be accepting your revised interpretation. The contract required a complete and accurate survey. I delivered one. You owe me $150 and a letter of professional reference." "We owe you nothing," Prout said flatly. "And if you attempt to use this fraudulent report to harm this council's legitimate business interests, we will bring criminal charges of professional fraud against you." "Under what evidence?" "We will find evidence," he said, and the naked honesty of that, the admission that they intended to construct a case rather than present a real one, was so brazen that it nearly took her breath away. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You will try," and she picked up her contract copy from the table and walked to the door. Vernon was already standing. It was in the next 48 hours that everything accelerated into chaos. Prout moved faster than she expected. By noon of that day, a warrant had been filed with the county justice of the peace, a man named Hollis who was not one of the 7, but who owed his position to them, charging Lavinia with professional fraud and filing false legal documents. Vernon read the warrant in his office with an expression of controlled fury and told her she was not under arrest because the warrant required a hearing, and the hearing required proper notice, and proper notice meant she had 3 days. 3 days, she said. The circuit judge in Abilene is 11 days away. Jim left 2 days ago. He will arrive before the hearing. Vernon set the warrant down. But the hearing is going to happen in front of Hollis, which means the council is going to control it. Can you challenge Hollis's jurisdiction? On what grounds, she thought. on the grounds that a matter involving federal land claims is outside a county justice's authority and requires federal jurisdiction. It is arguable. It is not certain. Vernon looked at her for a long moment. And in the meantime, they are going to tell everyone in this town that you are a fraud. Yes. And some of them will believe it. Yes. He picked up his hat. Then we had better make sure the people worth convincing hear your side of it first. What he did next surprised her completely. He went to the hotel, the saloon, the hardware store, the boarding house, and every other business on the main street of Redemption, and he talked to people. He did not make speeches. He did not issue proclamations. He simply told the truth, quietly and directly, to every person who would listen, that there was a federal land investigation underway, that the woman who had conducted the survey had done so honestly and completely, and that the charges against her were being brought by the same men whose land claims were under investigation. He told them that if anyone had questions, they should read the original Homestead Act and think carefully about where they imagined their own property rights came from and who was actually protecting those rights. She watched him do this from across the street and felt something enormous and irreversible settle into her. Several of the town's residents came to see her that evening at the hotel. A woman named Clara Odekirk, daughter of the family whose land had been stolen 7 years ago, who had heard from neighbors what the investigation involved, and who wept openly when Lavinia showed her the survey measurements that confirmed the original boundary lines. An older man named Ezra Tate, who had worked as a property clerk in the county's earliest years, and who had his own records that he had been afraid to bring forward. 2 homesteader families, who had been paying lease rates to the council for land they had begun to suspect they might have been entitled to own outright. Lavinia sat with all of them until late in the night and took their statements in writing and added them to the file she was building, and she thought about her father, who had believed that the truth, documented carefully and presented completely, would eventually weigh more than power. He had been right. He had just not lived long enough to see it. The hearing before Justice Hollies was set for the morning of the 3rd day, and the night before it, Vernon came to find her at the hotel with something in his expression that she had not seen there before. He knocked at her door, and when she opened it, he said, without preamble, "They have threatened to remove my badge." She stepped back to let him in. "When?" "This evening. Croft came to my office with 2 of the council members. He said the council has the authority to review my appointment, and that unless I ceased what he called interference in civil matters, they would initiate a review that would result in my removal." He sat in the chair by the window and looked at her. "They want me to step back from this. Will you?" He looked at her with something almost like surprise, as if the question were strange. "No, Vernon," she sat across from him. "This is your livelihood. It is the work you have given the last 4 years of your life to." "It is a job," he said. "I can find another job. I cannot find another." He stopped. A muscle in his jaw worked. Then he said more quietly, "I cannot step back from this, not from you and not from what is right. Those 2 things have become the same thing for me, which probably tells you something about where I am in all of this." She looked at him in the lamplight of the hotel room, this man who had ridden out every morning with coffee and quiet competence, who had stood in her corner without being asked and without conditions, who had chosen what was right over what was comfortable every single time he had been forced to choose, and she said, "I know where you are in all of this." "Do you?" he said. "I am in the same place," she said. "I have been for weeks. I am simply better at not saying it out loud." He was very still. "Lavinia." "I know the timing is terrible," she said. "The timing is terrible," he agreed, and then he stood up and crossed the room and took her face in his hands very carefully, and she put her hands over his, and they stood like that for a moment that felt completely separate from the urgency of everything around it. He kissed her once, with a gentleness that was completely at odds with everything she had been bracing for, and she kissed him back, and then they stood with their foreheads together and both of them breathed. "After tomorrow," he said. "After tomorrow," she said. The hearing room was the same council chamber where everything had begun, and when Lavinia arrived with Vernon beside her, she found it fuller than she expected. Clara Oudekirk was there, and Ezra Tate, and the two Homesteader families, and a number of other townspeople whose presence she had not anticipated, people who had apparently decided that whatever was happening warranted witnessing. Justice Hollis was a small, uncomfortable-looking man who clearly wished he were somewhere else. The council sat behind their long table with Croft at the center and Prout at his right, and they had brought a lawyer from the county seat, a man named Barfield who wore a very clean suit and looked at everyone in the room with professional contempt. Barfield presented the council's case with practiced efficiency. Miss Hawkins had produced a survey report that directly contradicted existing legal documents. She had attached a declaration falsely identifying herself as the daughter of a deceased federal surveyor. She had shared the report's findings with parties outside the council before formally delivering it. All of this constituted professional fraud. When it was her turn, Lavinia stood and presented her evidence in the same clear, precise language she put in her reports. She laid out the contract language, which contained no clause requiring results favorable to any party. She produced her father's professional license and his original survey notebooks, which she had kept in the hotel safe for the past 2 days. She presented the measurements, the boundary discrepancies, the comparison between the original federal grants and the current council claims, and the witness statements from Clara Oudekirk and Ezra Tate. She was very thorough and she was very composed, and she watched Justice Hollis grow increasingly unhappy as she spoke, because the evidence was real and he could see it, and he was a man who, whatever his loyalties, was not quite prepared to be the person who sent a clearly innocent woman to jail on manufactured charges in front of a room full of witnesses. Croft leaned over and said something to Barfield, and Barfield stood and said that the witness statements were inadmissible in a preliminary hearing, and then something unexpected happened. Vernon stood up. He stood up from his seat along the wall and said, clearly enough for the whole room to hear, "I would like to address the council." Hollis looked at him uncertainly. "Marshal, with respect, Your Honor, what is happening in this room is not a legitimate legal proceeding, and everyone in it knows that. What is happening is that 7 men who have been operating on fraudulent land claims for nearly a decade are attempting to use this court to silence the woman who documented their fraud, because she is the only person in the last 10 years who has had both the evidence and the courage to bring it forward." He looked at the council directly. "This woman signed a contract with you. The contract required a complete and accurate survey. She delivered one. She got up before dawn every morning for 3 weeks and worked in the field until dark, and she measured every inch of that territory, and she put every number down exactly as she found it, and I know that because I was there." He paused. "She kept her word, every single word she gave you, and you broke yours." The room was very quiet. "This woman kept her word," he said again, looking at each of the 7 men in turn, "and you broke yours. And I am asking every person in this room to think very carefully about what they are prepared to let this council do to someone who did exactly what she promised." The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. It had weight. It had the weight of 30-odd people who had come to watch a hearing and who were now watching something else, something that was asking them directly what they believed about right and wrong. Elias Croft's face had gone dark red. "This is highly irregular. So is charging a woman with fraud for delivering an accurate survey," Clara Oudekirk said from the back of the room, and several people around her murmured in agreement. Hollis looked like a man standing in a current that was moving faster than he could manage. He shuffled his papers. He looked at Barfield. Barfield leaned close and said something very quietly, and Hollis shook his head, and Barfield's expression went flat. "I am going to recess this hearing," Hollis said, "pending additional review of the applicable jurisdiction." "You cannot recess," Prout started. "I can and I am," Hollis said, with a firmness that surprised everyone, including apparently himself. "This matter is recessed for a period of 14 days. during which time I am requesting guidance from the Federal Circuit Court regarding applicable jurisdiction over matters involving federal land grants." He stood up with the air of a man who has done something that was harder than it looked and wants to leave quickly before anyone can stop him. He left quickly. The counsel sat at their table in the sudden noise of the room, and Prout looked at Lavinia with an expression of cold, concentrated anger and said nothing. Vernon was at her side within moments, and he said quietly, "We need to leave. Now." They walked out of the council chamber into the bright October morning, and Clara Oudekirk caught up with them on the steps and gripped Lavinia's hands and said, "Thank you. Whatever happens, thank you." And Lavinia felt the enormous gratitude of having done the thing she had come here to do, delivered the truth she had been carrying for years to the place where it could actually matter. But the matter was not over. The council, denied the legal route, moved to the extra-legal one. That afternoon Vernon received notification that the council was initiating a formal review of his appointment. 2 days later, a county commissioner, Lavinia, had never heard of, arrived from the county seat to conduct what was described as a routine administrative evaluation. Vernon submitted to it calmly and completely and told her afterward with characteristic directness that the evaluation was a pretext and they both knew it. "They cannot remove you without cause," she said. "They will manufacture cause," he said. "They are practiced at it. The circuit judge may or may not arrive before they find a way to act." She sat across from him in his office and thought about hidden motives and dark pasts and the way power protected itself. And she thought about Jim Reeves on the road to Abilene and whether the documents had arrived safely. And she thought about everything that had led her here and everything that depended on what happened next. Then she thought about Vernon standing in that room and saying those words, and something resolved in her that had nothing to do with strategy. "Whatever happens," she said, "I want you to know that I did not expect this." He looked at her. "The trouble with the council, you," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Neither did I. I have been on my own for 7 years," she said. "I have managed everything on my own, and I have been quite good at it, and I had more or less decided that was how it was going to remain. And now," he said, "and now I am sitting in a marshal's office in a town that is trying to ruin both of us," she said, "and I am not sorry about any of it, including the part where it is your fault." He laughed, actually laughed, the warm, surprised sound of a man genuinely caught off guard. And then he stood up and came around the desk, and she stood to meet him. And he put his arms around her, and she put her face against his shoulder. And they stood like that in the marshal's office in the afternoon light, and it was the most peace she had felt in years. 8 days after Jim Reeves left for Abilene, a rider arrived in Redemption with a sealed document from the circuit court. Vernon brought it to the hotel where Lavinia was reviewing her notes, and she read it at the small writing desk with her hands very steady because she would not let them shake. And when she finished, she set it down and said, "The Federal Land Court is accepting jurisdiction. The circuit judge will arrive within 20 days to conduct a full evidentiary hearing." Vernon exhaled. "That is not all," she said. She picked the document up again. "He has issued a temporary injunction prohibiting the council from taking any legal or administrative action against any party involved in the land investigation pending the hearing. That includes the fraud charges. That includes," she looked up, "the marshal's appointment review." Vernon sat down in the room's second chair with the careful movement of a man who has been bracing for something for a long time and has just been allowed to stop. "Jim made it," he said. "Jim made it," she confirmed. They looked at each other across the small hotel room, and the quality of the silence was something she wanted to keep. "It is not finished," she said. "I know," he said, "but the worst is over." She looked at him, this man who had stood between her and the full force of what powerful people did when they felt threatened, who had done it without conditions and without asking her to be anything other than exactly who she was, and she said, "Vernon." "Yes," he said, "I am not going back to Georgia after this." Something in his face changed, the last careful restraint dissolving into something open and uncomplicated. "No," he said. "I did not think you would be." "I have not decided entirely where I am going," she said, "but I have decided some things." "Tell me," he said. "I have decided that I am going to stay in redemption until the hearing is complete and the judgment is recorded," she said. "And I have decided that after that I would like to establish a proper survey practice, because there is a great deal of federal territory in this region that has never been correctly measured, and someone should do it honestly." She looked at him steadily. "And I have decided that I do not want to do any of that alone." Vernon Wallace crossed the hotel room in 3 strides, and he kissed her with considerably less restraint than the first time, and she kissed him back with none whatsoever. And when they finally separated, she was laughing, and so was he. And the sound of it was the best thing she had heard in all her years of doing difficult things alone. The 20 days before the circuit judge's arrival were not quiet exactly, but they were different. The counsel, bound by the injunction, could not move openly against either of them, and their inability to act directly seemed to have reduced their capacity to threaten, because a great deal of the fear they generated had always depended on the belief that they could do whatever they decided to do without consequences. The injunction established a consequence, visible and federal, and it changed the atmosphere in redemption measurably. People who had been careful around Lavinia began to speak to her openly. Ezra Tate brought her additional records from his years as a property clerk, documents that added texture and additional evidence to the picture of systematic fraud her father's papers and her own survey had already built. Clara Odekirk introduced her to 3 other families who had land histories that bore investigation. The work of building the evidentiary file for the federal hearing became, in those 3 weeks, a collaborative effort involving more of Redemption's residents than Lavinia had imagined, people who had been carrying their own pieces of the story for years and waiting for a moment when coming forward seemed survivable. She and Vernon had supper together every evening during that time, alternating between the hotel and the boarding house, and they talked through the case and they talked through other things, easier things. His years in Kansas and her years in Georgia, and what they both imagined beyond the immediate horizon. He told her about the land along the Brazos he had always liked the look of, a particular stretch of river bottom with good soil and old cottonwood trees that he had passed through on a case 2 years earlier, and thought about more than made sense for a man with no plans to farm. She told him about a house her father had described once, a house with a porch that faced west so you could watch the light change in the evenings, and he looked at her with an expression she recognized as a man filing something carefully away. She held his hand walking back from the boarding house on a November evening with the stars enormous overhead and the cold coming in from the north, and she thought about the word home, which she had not been able to apply to any place since Georgia, and she tried it quietly in her mind with redemption attached to it, which produced a feeling she was not quite ready to say out loud. She said it on a different evening when they were sitting on the hotel porch watching the last of the sunset drain out of the sky, and she said it sideways, which was how she said most things that mattered. "I think I could learn to like it here," she said. Vernon looked at her in the almost dark, and his face was entirely soft and open in the way she was learning was the expression he reserved only for her. "I think I could give you very good reasons to," he said. Circuit Judge Samuel Hathaway arrived in Redemption on a Wednesday morning in late November, riding in on the stage with 2 court clerks, and a quiet authority that came from 20 years of federal jurisprudence in territories where the law was still establishing itself. He was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with a white beard and the eyes of someone who had heard every possible version of every possible story and was interested only in what the documents said. He set up in the town's small courthouse, which was a newer building than most, and he ran the evidentiary hearing over 3 days with rigorous procedural attention. Lavinia presented her survey findings and her father's original records. Ezra Tate presented his property clerk documents. Clara Oudekirk presented the Oudekirk family's original federal land grant, which she had kept in a tin box for 7 years because her mother had told her to keep it no matter what. 3 other families presented their own documentation. Vernon submitted a formal statement regarding what he had personally witnessed during the survey work. The council's lawyer Barfield argued that all of it was circumstantial and challenged Lavinia's credentials, which gave her the particular pleasure of presenting her federal surveyor's certification and her father's, which together formed an unbroken chain of professional licensure going back to 1859. Judge Hathaway was not a man who made hasty decisions, but on the evening of the 3rd day, he called both parties to the courthouse and issued his preliminary ruling. The existing land claims of the Redemption Town Council in 4 of the disputed parcels were suspended pending full investigation by the General Land Office. The fraud charges against Lavinia Hawkins were dismissed. The council's review of Marshal Wallace's appointment was declared outside the scope of their authority and voided, and the families with documented original grants, the Oudekirks and the others, were entitled to file formal restoration claims, which the judge indicated he would expedite. Elias Croft sat in the courthouse with the carefully blank face of a man watching the foundation of something he built shift and crack beneath him. Aldous Prout looked straight ahead with the expression of a man calculating what was still salvageable. The other 5 council members looked at various points in the room with the expressions of people who had always known, somewhere underneath everything, that this particular accounting would come. Lavinia stood in the courthouse and listened to the judge's ruling and felt something release in her chest that had been held tight since the morning she found her father's papers after his death, since the day she understood what had happened to him and why, since the years she had spent carrying the evidence of it like a debt she owed him. She had carried it all the way to redemption, and she had laid it down in the right place, and the ground was holding. Vernon was standing next to her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and when the judge finished speaking, Vernon turned and looked at her with an expression that was so completely unguarded that she felt tears rise unexpectedly, which almost never happened to her, and she blinked them back and looked at the ceiling for a moment and then looked back at him. "You did it," he said quietly. "We did it," she said. He took her hand, right there in the courthouse with Judge Hathaway's clerk still shuffling papers, and the council still sitting at their table and half the town of Redemption pressed into the gallery behind them. And she squeezed his hand back and thought about her father, who would have been so proud and so happy, and who she missed with a grief that the resolution of this had not ended but had in some way made more bearable, because she had finally done the thing he died before he could do himself. The aftermath of the ruling unfolded over the following months, with the systematic thoroughness that federal land administration required. The General Land Office dispatched a team of investigators in the spring of 1883, and Lavinia worked alongside them for 6 weeks, conducting additional survey verification in areas her original work had flagged but not fully examined. The investigation confirmed everything her survey and her father's records had documented, and then some. The fraudulent claims were formally voided. 4 of the 7 council members faced federal fraud charges, including Prout, whose bank records revealed the financial architecture underlying the entire scheme. Elias Croft resigned from the council before charges could be filed and left Redemption for parts unknown. Vernon tracked down reliable information that Croft had gone to Colorado, which was far enough and likely to produce its own reckoning. Clara Oudekirk and her family received formal title to the land that had been taken from them. The restoration process for the other affected families was longer and more complicated but ultimately successful. Ezra Tate, who was 71 years old and had spent 7 years afraid to come forward, told Lavinia when it was all settled that he felt like he had put down a weight he had stopped noticing he was carrying. She understood that feeling exactly. Vernon's badge was not only retained but formally commended by a letter from the federal court That was the first official recognition he had received in 4 years of work, and he read it at his desk in the marshal's office, and then set it down and looked slightly embarrassed to have been moved by it, which made her love him more than she already did, which was already a great deal. They were married in March of 1883, on a Saturday morning in the Redemption Church, which had gotten a new coat of whitewash over the winter and looked considerably better for it. The ceremony was conducted by the minister, a gentle man named Harshaw, who had told Vernon several months earlier that he had always hoped the marshal would find someone worth keeping, and who now looked very satisfied with how things had turned out. Clara Odekirk stood with Lavinia as her witness. Jim Reeves, who had ridden 400 miles in difficult weather because Vernon trusted him, stood with Vernon as his. The council chamber was empty that morning because most of its former occupants were either gone or occupied with federal proceedings. But the church was full because Redemption was a town that had just been reminded of what an honest foundation looked like, and people turned out in significant numbers to celebrate when something good was built on one. Lavinia wore the dark green wool dress because it was the best thing she owned, and because Vernon had told her once, casually, that it was the color she had been wearing when she first walked down the main street of Redemption, and he had thought, before he even knew her name, that this was a woman worth knowing. She carried a small bunch of late winter flowers Clara had found somewhere. When the minister asked if she had anything to say in addition to the formal vows, she looked at Vernon and said, very clearly, "I have been on my own for a long time, and I was very good at it, and I am not giving up any of the parts of myself that made me good at it. I am just choosing not to be alone anymore, with you, which I think is a different and better kind of strength than the solitary kind, and I intend to keep choosing it every day for the rest of my life." Vernon looked at her through the whole of this speech with the expression he reserved only for her, warm and direct and completely undefended, and when she finished he said, "I will hold you to that." They rode out to the land along the Brazos in April, the stretch of river bottom with the cottonwood trees he had told her about, and they stood on a low bluff above the river in the spring light and looked at what was there. The soil was good. The cottonwoods were old and enormous and would provide shade in the summer. There was a spring-fed creek that ran clear even at the end of dry months. "I could build a porch that faces west," he said. She looked at the western sky above the flat grassland and thought about a house her father had described, and she thought about all the roads she had walked to get to this particular bluff above this particular river, and she thought about how the thing you are looking for sometimes turns out to be different in shape than you imagine but identical in all the qualities that actually matter. "Yes," she said, "I think you could." They filed on the land under the Homestead Act before summer. Vernon contracted with 2 builders from town, and the house went up through the hot summer months, a solid frame structure with a proper foundation and a porch that faced exactly west. Lavinia continued her survey practice during the construction, taking contracts from the General Land Office for verification work in the surrounding territory, which provided steady income and the professional satisfaction of work she was genuinely excellent at. Vernon continued as marshal through the transition period, as the town council was reconstituted with new members who included, in a development that still occasionally surprised her, Ezra Tate, who turned out to have opinions about civic governance that were considerably more sophisticated than anyone had given him credit for. They moved into the house in September of 1883, a year almost to the day after Lavinia had stepped off the stage in Redemption with $40 and a carpetbag, and no intention of trusting anyone. The house smelled of new wood, and the cottonwoods outside made a sound in the wind that she quickly decided was one of her favorite sounds in the world. That first evening in the house, they sat on the west porch as the sunset turned the sky over the Brazos country from gold to deep orange to the particular shade of purple that comes just before the stars appear, and Vernon had his arm around her and she had her head against his shoulder, and neither of them spoke for a long time because the silence was too good to interrupt. "I have been thinking," she said eventually. "About what?" "About the Northwest Survey Territory. There are 3 additional parcels that the General Land Office flagged as potentially unverified. They want a contractor for the spring assessment." He laughed quietly, the sound rumbling in his chest beneath her ear. "Of course you have. I have also been thinking about other things," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "What kind of other things?" She sat up and looked at him in the last of the light, and she did not say anything for a moment, and then she did not need to because his expression changed as he read hers, and the change was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen on any face. "Are you telling me?" he said very carefully. "I am," she said. He put his hand against her face in the way he had done on that evening in his office when everything was still uncertain, and he looked at her with an openness that she would have once thought a man could not sustain past the initial urgency of love, but that she had discovered was simply how Vernon Wallace was built, open and present and entirely himself at all times. "Lavinia," he said. "I know," she said, smiling. "I am going to need a moment," he said. "Take your time," she said, and laughed when he pulled her close and pressed his face into her hair and stayed there for a long moment that was not quite stillness but something better. Their son was born in the spring of 1884, in the house on the Brazos, in the room they had built with the window facing east so the morning light would come in. They named him Edmund after her father, which was a decision she had made before the birth and Vernon had confirmed without hesitation, because he had understood from the first time she talked about her father what Edmund Morrow had meant to her, and what he deserved to be remembered for. Edmund was a child of healthy lungs and considerable opinions from his earliest days, which his mother regarded with professional respect, and his father with a kind of delighted helplessness. Clara Odekirk came to see the baby 3 days after the birth, and held him with practiced ease, and told Lavinia that he had his father's jaw and his mother's expression, which was, everyone who looked at him agreed, entirely accurate. Life on the Brazos settled into the rhythms that frontier life produces in people who have chosen it with their eyes open, not easy but honest, full of work and weather, and the slow accumulation of things built and tended. Lavinia's survey practice grew steadily through the mid-1880s as the General Land Office pursued verification work across the region, and she trained 2 apprentices. One of them, a young woman from the hill country named Agnes, who reminded her enough of her younger self to make her simultaneously nostalgic and fiercely protective. Vernon's tenure as marshal continued with the reputation he had always had. A man who enforced the law because he believed in it, and who would tell you to your face when he thought you were wrong, and who was never on the side of power simply because power asked him to be. The Council of Redemption, reconstituted and functioning under considerably more scrutiny than before, operated now in the way that civil governance was meant to operate, with public record and public accountability, and the knowledge that the people of the town were paying attention in a way they had not always been. It was not perfect, because nothing was, but it was better than it had been, and that was the thing worth holding on to. In the summer of 1885, they sat on the west porch again in the evening with Edmund between them, a solid and emphatic 1-year-old who had recently discovered that he could pull himself upright by hanging onto the porch railing, and who spent much of each day conducting experiments in this capacity. Lavinia was watching the sunset and thinking, in the unfocused, comfortable way that evenings on that porch always produced in her, about all the distance between here and where she had started. "What are you thinking about?" Vernon said. "Georgia," she said, "and how far it is from here." Good far or bad far, she considered it honestly the way she considered everything. "Good far," she said. "The kind of far that means you have traveled a long way to a good place." Edmund released the railing and sat down with a thump and looked at the sunset with an expression of serious consideration, and Lavinia reached over and straightened his small collar automatically and felt the full accumulated weight of the word home settle into her completely and stay. "Vernon," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am very glad you were at that stage stop," she said. He looked at her across their son's head with the expression she had by now spent 3 years learning and still found inexhaustible. "So am I," he said, "more than I know how to say." "You do not have to say it," she said. "I know," he said. "You have never needed me to." He took her hand, the way he had taken it in the courthouse with half of redemption watching and both their futures uncertain, and she laced her fingers through his, and the cottonwood trees moved in the evening wind above the brazos, and the sky went through its sequence of colors, gold and orange and deep rose, and then the first cool blue of evening, and the stars came out one by one over the Texas grassland, and the three of them sat on the west-facing porch of the house they had built on honest ground. And it was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything. The papers her father had carried from Georgia sat now in a cedar box in the house's main room, no longer hidden in a carpetbag lining, no longer a dangerous secret, no longer a weight to be carried alone. They were evidence in a closed case, part of the public record of a federal land investigation that had restored what had been stolen and established what had been denied. Edmund Morrow's work had not been lost. It had been delivered by his daughter to exactly the place it needed to go. She thought about that often in the years that followed. She thought about it when a second child arrived in 1887, a daughter they named Frances for Vernon's mother, who was living out her last years in Kansas, and who came to Redemption to see the baby and stayed 3 months because, as she told Vernon with characteristic directness, she had no intention of leaving until she was satisfied that her son was entirely and irrevocably happy, which she determined to her own satisfaction by the second week of her visit, and then stayed another 10 weeks anyway because the porch and the river and the sound of the cottonwoods in the wind were, as she said, not the kind of thing you left before you had to. The Redemption of 1887 was different from the Redemption of 1882 in visible ways. The land office was under new management and was rigorously administered. The families who had received restoration of their proper holdings had built and planted and stayed, adding to the town's foundation. The railroad that the council had always claimed to be building toward came through 2 years after the fraud judgment, not on the council's terms, but on the territory's legitimate boundaries, which made the route slightly different than originally planned but considerably more legally stable. Ezra Tate was on the town council until he was 78 years old and was, by universal agreement, the most reliably honest voice in any room he occupied. Clara Odekirk married a man from a neighboring county in 1885, a quiet farmer with good land and better character, and she and Lavinia maintained the friendship that had begun in the hearing room in ways that outlasted all the urgency of those first weeks and became simply part of the texture of their shared lives in that country. Vernon eventually passed his badge to a deputy he had trained over 4 years, a young man named Carson who had every quality Vernon had looked for without knowing he was looking for them, honest and steady, and on the right side of things instinctively. Vernon stayed on in an advisory capacity for a year after the formal transfer, which in practice meant he was available when Carson needed counsel and unavailable when he did not. And he spent the time he had freed up building a second room onto the house and working the river bottom land with a thoroughness that satisfied something in him that law enforcement never quite reached, the direct relationship between effort and result that farming provided in a way nothing else quite did. Lavinia's survey practice continued into the 1890s, adapting as the territory continued to be documented and settled, moving from the urgent work of establishing correct boundaries on fraudulent old claims to the steady professional work of documenting new settlement in territories that were still being opened. She wrote a professional paper in 1891 about methodology for detecting boundary manipulation in historical land documents, which was published in a surveyor's journal out of St. Louis, and which Agnes, her former apprentice, carried around in her saddlebag for years. Edmund, at 7, showed signs of his mother's mathematical precision and his father's physical ease in the saddle, which was a combination that would serve him well in whatever he eventually chose to do. Francis, at 4, showed signs of considerable determination that reminded Vernon, he said, of someone he knew, which made Lavinia laugh every time he said it, which was often. On an October evening in 1889, exactly 7 years after Lavinia had stepped off the stage in Redemption with her secret and her father's papers and her careful solitary plan, she stood on the west porch of the house on the Brazos and watched Vernon help Edmund identify the first stars appearing above the mesquite line on the horizon, his voice carrying in the still air, patient and unhurried. The voice of a man who had found the life he was supposed to have and was not taking any of it for granted. She thought about the council chamber and the warrant and the note slipped under her hotel door. She thought about riding out before dawn with her theodolite and her surveyor's chain and her notebook full of the truth. She thought about a man on a bay horse on a hilltop watching from 100 yards away to make sure she was safe. She thought about the sound of Vernon's voice in that room saying the words that had changed everything, simple and direct and entirely loyal, words that had cost him something and that he had chosen to say anyway. This woman kept her word, and you broke yours. She had kept her word to the council and to the contract, and to her father and to herself, all of it, every promise she had ever made. And the man who had seen her keep it was standing 20 feet away on the same honest ground they had built together, turning her son's face gently toward a particular star, and telling him what it was called and why people had named it that, and how you could use it to find your way when you were lost. The cottonwoods moved. The river sound carried up the bluff. The sky went through its colors. She went inside and lit the lamp and set the table for supper, and when Vernon and Edmund came in, and Frances woke from her nap and came padding down the hallway in her socks, and the house filled with the noise of a family that had not existed 7 years ago, and that she could not now imagine having lived without. She set the last dish on the table and looked at all of it and felt something so complete and so settled that there was no word she knew that was equal to it. Not happiness, though it was that. Not relief, though that was in it too. Not love, though that was at the center of everything. It was simply rightness, the particular quality of a life that has arrived at the place it was always pointing toward, through roads that were harder and longer than they needed to be, through years of carrying things alone, through the dark past into the open present, through secrets held tight until they could be released in the right place to the right people at the right time. She sat down at the table in the lamplight with her family, and the wind came off the Brazos through the open window, and Edmund asked why stars had names, and Frances demanded more cornbread, and Vernon looked across the table at Lavinia with those dark eyes that had seen her clearly from the very first morning, and she looked back at him the same way, and they were home.